Lori Thornley, our colleague from Evaluation Systems, who's our technical contractor, and she's going to tell you how to get to Cycle 2 to make sure you have a copy with you as we move through this webinar. So, Lori, back to you.
Thanks, Amy, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We will be taking a deep dive into the CalTPA Cycle 2 today. And so you may or may not find it helpful to have a copy of the guide at your disposal so that you can make notes to yourself as we go along. Presumably most of you have access or know where to find that document, but in case you don't, I am to put in the chat a URL that will take you to the CalTPA faculty resource webpage. And on that webpage, if you scroll down about midway, there's the URL. Scroll down, oh, excuse me. That's the faculty resource webpage. Scroll down midway to the assessment materials section. Go ahead and open that up. You'll find links to 3 zip files, multiple subject, single subject, and world language. We'll be going through the multiple subject guide today, but you can access any of these materials by downloading the zip file. And then also posted in the chat window is the zip file password. You'll need that in order to access the materials within. And contained within each zip file is a PDF version of both cycles 1 and 2, as well as all of the written evidence templates that candidates use to submit their evidence for the cycles. We'll give you a moment here for those who may be downloading and opening the zip file to get your Cycle 2 copy out and available. And I will, while you're doing that, I will turn it back over to Amy.
Thank you, Lori. We're going to go ahead and move to our next slide and review our agenda. But first, we're going to start with welcome and introduction. So again, welcome to the afternoon. We plan to be with you until 3 o'clock. So plenty of time to walk through Cycle 2. So I am Amy Rising, Director of Performance Assessment Policy and Development. Great to be with all of you. And I'll introduce my colleague, James. James, would you like to say hello?
Yes, thank you. I'm James Webb. I'm a consultant with the Performance Assessment Development Team, working with Amy Rising and Gay Roby, and I'm excited to share with you the information that we have with regard to the CalTPA Cycle 2 deep dive. Just also want to welcome all the different folks that we probably have in the webinar. We have members from preliminary programs, also induction programs, so we just want to welcome everyone to this particular webinar today. Just one note, we are recording this webinar, so the Zoom is being recorded at this time and will be posted onto our playlist at the Commission's website. In addition, this recording will have closed captioning, so we will be able to make sure that it is compliant for everyone who may need assistive devices in order to access that information. So Amy, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thanks, James. And again, I just want to pause and say to you, yes, this PowerPoint will be posted along with the recording for you to access after we conclude today or share with other colleagues. So yes, 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 we are going to post this presentation for you. All right, let's keep going. Next slide, please. So we want to pause and make sure everyone who is helping facilitate has a chance to be introduced. So our colleague Lori Thornley, Program Manager with Evaluation Systems, is with us to help navigate and also answer questions related to the system itself. So Lori, would you like to say hello?
Sure, and again, hello and welcome everyone. Glad to be with you this afternoon.
Great, next slide. we want to make sure that we take time to introduce our two lead assessors who are helping us facilitate this webinar today and who will be sharing their great depth of knowledge and expertise and all they've been learning over the many years now as they've worked with us to develop the TPA and then also provide that important coaching to assessors as we train our assessors and maintain that assessor pool to make sure everyone is scoring reliably. So first, I'll introduce Mick Verdi. Mick joins us from the California State University, San Bernardino. Mick, would you like to say hello?
Yep. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here.
And Mick is a specialist in science assessments and other areas of expertise. And then we're also joined by Beth Roybal, and she joins us from the Salinas Union High School District. Beth, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the coaches, the induction people. That's my kind of love, and I know you're going to be helping with TPA, and I really appreciate you being here today.
Great. And Beth is a lead assessor and a specialist in the area of English. I was going to say literacy, English and literacy, correct? So
Correct.
We're happy to have both of you with us, and we're really excited to get to have them be with us this afternoon and share their expertise. So welcome and thank you to both of you. So let's keep going. Brings us to our agenda. So we've started with our welcome and introductions. We will follow that up with a quick review of our online webinar norms. As we all work together online, it's important for us all to agree to these norms. We'll then go quickly into the guide itself and walk through all the different components of the guide and what is there for you as support and what it is in fact that candidates see as they move through the guide and understand about the 4 steps and the evidence that's required, and of course the important rubrics that are used to score the evidence. If we have time, we will take a quick stretch break. And I believe they'll get to be able to watch the otters at the Monterey Sea Aquarium. So that's always exciting. The otters are wonderful company. Then we'll come back and get into some more tips about how to successfully navigate Cycle 2, and then talk about how you can access all the important assessment materials. And then, of course, our program supports that we will be offering to you this fall as we continue together as a learning community and know that we're here to support you in so many different ways. So we will share that information at the end of the presentation. If we do get to the point where we're having a lot of questions and we need to provide some support post the 3 o'clock time for concluding this webinar, we will stay on and answer your questions. And just know this is one of many supports available to you. So with that, let's keep going. And James, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. So we have some norms that we would like to review prior to getting into the material that we'll share with you today. All microphones have been muted. If you would like to be recognized, you can ask the moderator to have your microphone unmuted. And we would like to ask that everyone remain muted so that we can eliminate the background noise that may detract from the presentation. In addition, as Amy shared, we will be using the chat for posting questions, and we will respond throughout the presentation if possible. But please understand that if we don't get to everything, we will take your email address and may need to follow up, especially if it's one that does require a considerable amount of possible research and or additional information. We ask that you keep your questions to a general focus rather than program specific so that we can make sure that we're reaching all members of our audience. We do ask that you avoid multitasking during the webinar. I know it's hard. We have a lot of things going on. Just in a meeting that we were just having, I was trying to handle pre-algebra, multiplying exponents, and I needed to remember that my focus was in my meeting. The other thing is that we want to honor the time for both participants and presenters. So please provide that equity of voice that we have so that everyone who is presenting can have a chance to listen and hear all the great information. And then finally, what we would like for you to do is that in your Zoom window, please go up to the upper right-hand corner and click on Speaker View. as opposed to gallery view, so that you will be able to have the full display in front of you with just the speaker who is presenting the information. This will allow you to not have the gallery view and possibly be distracted from everyone. And then if you can, we definitely encourage everyone to enable their video so that we can see you. However, if you are having bandwidth and or internet issues, we understand that you may need to turn your video off in order to be able to access the information. One last item is that we are recording this. Just want to remind everyone that we are. And if you haven't done so already, if you could please put your name and the program which you represent into the chat, that will allow us to know who's here in attendance and give us records for what we know that we may need to follow up with, and make sure that we tailor all of our information to those of you who are with us. And I see that those names are coming in now. Perfect. So let's start with our CalTPA overview. So in looking at the next slide, what we're going to do is we're going to give you a very 10,000 foot level view of the CalTPA. So what I'd like is have everyone understand what the structure is. The CalTPA is broken into 2 instructional cycles, both of which follow the same format in the steps. Step 1 is plan, step 2 is teach and assess, step 3 is reflect, and step 4 is apply. And this cycle works because, as we know, the purpose of the CalTPA, the purpose of preliminary programs and that of induction programs, is to have educators go into their career with this habit of mind always in place. So we always utilize this habit of understanding that when we are working with educators, coaching educators, that they understand this cycle and how it applies in all aspects of their educational career. Instructional Cycle 1, which we took a deep dive with yesterday, was all about learning about students and planning instruction. What goes into that understanding of the lesson planning process, teaching a lesson, and then reflecting on the lesson and applying new understanding due to what you've learned after coming back and teaching your students and gathering some assessment information. Today, we're going to be doing an in-depth deep dive into Instructional Cycle 2, which focuses on assessment-driven instruction. And what we will do is similar to the format that we followed yesterday, is that we will begin looking in depth at the 4 different steps, providing some tips and some ideas from our lead assessors who are joining us, Mick and Beth, and then some other considerations as you're working with candidates through the CalTPA. So what I'd like to do now is turn it back to Amy, who's going to walk through ways that you can introduce Cycle 2. And again, these are ideas that could be working with either preliminary programs or induction programs. So Amy, turn it back to you.
Great, thank you, James. So let's go to the next slide. So we just want to lay out for you a little bit about how the guide is set up. So the guide itself that candidates receive when they register includes an overview of the instructional cycle and walks them through that underlying theory of action, basically talks about what's going to be happening in the cycle, and then what happens in each of the 4 steps. Then we follow that with a table that lays out the same information for the candidate, because we know some learners, some readers really like to see a very succinct description of what needs to be done. So we have a table that is step by step that provides that information to the candidate. What is required of them, and then what is the evidence to be submitted. And then we have that step by step, more detailed narrative about each step of the 4 and what is expected from the candidate. So we just want to offer to you, those of you who are working with candidates and preparing them to engage in Cycle 2, that there are lots of ways to cover the material in the guide and having opportunities for the candidates to not only individually read through the directions, but then have them do something with the material, create a poster, have them explain it to each other, do a jigsaw activity, right? And that engagement that you provide to them will help them actually read the text and pay attention to the directions. Make it hands-on and your candidates will have success. These are complex assessments and there are many parts and pieces, and sometimes candidates overlook or skip a step, which can sometimes lead to them having to redo the work. And we certainly don't want that to happen with our candidates. So do please find ways to help them engage with the assessment guide that we're going to move into here in a second. Next slide. Few tips for introducing cycle 2. We do want you to know there are call out boxes, and then also it's very important to talk about the rubric based scoring system that we use in these instructional cycles. So you want to make sure that candidates are aware of the rubrics and the language in the rubrics, but also just how they're formatted and set up. So there are structures and levels to our rubrics. They all start with one essential question. That essential question is the description of what is expected, what we are measuring, and then the language is aligned to the essential question. Then sometimes in our language in a rubric, we'll use terms like and means both. If we say or, it's either or. Sometimes we say and/or, and there's a choice for the candidate. And then there are these different constructs that are measured inside of each rubric, and we'll go over that with you later in the presentation. And then importantly, at the bottom of the rubric, there's information about which sources of evidence are used to make the score judgment and the TPEs that are measured. Next slide, please. So this is going to take us into cycle 2. So let's go ahead. We're going to open up cycle 2 and take you right in there. We're going to start by looking at the preamble, just skip over the contents that are provided and get into the overview, but we'll pause here for a minute and make sure you all either have it up, or if you have a hard copy, we encourage you to get out a highlighter and highlight different parts of the information as we go through. All right, so this is the cover page of the performance assessment guide. What's important to note here is down below the photograph, you can see in red letters version 03. Yes, this is the third version of this assessment guide. We promised way back when we started the redevelopment process several years ago, 4 years ago now, that we would not allow this to be a static document, that we would, when we were finding that candidates were having difficulty understanding directions or things weren't quite aligned or our language didn't quite line up, that we would work on that and we would make the guide more coherent and clear for our candidates. So what is important is that you do want to always check the front cover of the guide, make sure you're in the right version. This year for our 2020-2021 academic year, we are in version 03, the third version. These materials were released to candidates in July, so if they registered in July or beyond, this is the version they received. And this version was shared with all of the programs back in June. So everyone should be familiar with and using this version, version 03. All right, we want to pause here and just take a quick look at our preamble together. So important. This was put here again by the design team of 23 educators that worked with us over 2 years, and then many stayed with us as lead assessors. And it's just really important to pause and make sure that this preamble is part of your discussion with your candidates. So effective teachers strive for educational opportunities that are driven by equity and culturally responsive practices to promote each student's academic success and well-being. So we want to make sure that in California, our teachers recognize, respect, and use students' strengths, experiences, and backgrounds as assets for teaching and learning, as assets for planning instruction. What is it that the students know and are able to do? What do they bring with them into the classroom? And how do we build forward from that. So an asset-based approach to instructional design and to the teaching and assessing of students as they are in our classroom. We certainly want our teachers in California to confront institutional bias of student marginalization, and we want them to set aside deficit-based schooling, and we want them to not have low expectations of students. We want them to have high expectations of our students in California. The second paragraph gets into how we speak and use language in this guide. When we say all students, we are referring to all TK-12 students. It is an inclusive term that we use, and we need to just recognize that our students in California exhibit a wide range of learning and behavioral characteristics, disabilities, dyslexia, intellectual or academic advancement, etc. And we want to be appreciative of that range of diversity and be supportive. We also want to be particularly paying attention to and supporting our students whose first language is not English or is English and they need additional support because they're a standard English learner. And again, just a final note that all students means all students, every single student in our classroom. So with that, we'll move on. The guide then goes into just an acknowledgement of who helped develop the guide, many educators working with us over the years. So really the redevelopment was by California educators for California educators as we all work together to support the development of new teachers and welcome them into our profession. We do have a long history in California of using performance assessment. We have broke the 20-year barrier and are moving into the 21st year of using performance assessment. So we have a lot of experience in this state. The assessment cycle starts with an overview, which basically reminds the candidate there are 4 steps: plan, teach, assess, reflect, and apply. And it provides a narrative overview of what will happen in this 4-step instructional cycle that should take candidates anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks to complete. So these are embedded in coursework and in clinical practice, and candidates should receive support from their faculty and supervising teachers, mentors, and coaches as they engage in this work. So let's keep going. Because cycle 2 is very focused on assessment, we provide descriptions. So informal assessment, this is a type of assessment we're looking for in cycle 2. And then we go on and define student self-assessment. Students looking at their own work based on a rubric and determining whether or not their own work has met the criteria of the rubric. And then finally, formal assessment. That's when we ask candidates to demonstrate for us through a product, process, or performance their level of understanding and capacity to demonstrate those knowledge, skills, and abilities of the content for which we are teaching. Now, it is important in cycle 2, just as it was in cycle 1, that candidates are aware of and have access to learning and then demonstrating how they use universal design for learning. So important that our students have multiple modalities and have different ways to access content and different ways to show us what they are capable of. One of the words that we've been using, of course, is the word asset. And we have found over the years that we needed to be very explicit and detailed in our definition of asset. So this is a new call out box this year, and it provides a more in-depth definition of asset-based approaches. And we point out that this is based on the strengths that the students bring to our classrooms, and it supports diversity in thought, culture, and traits, and that these are all good things, positive things that students are bringing into our classrooms. And the question is, once we understand what those assets are, how do we then build instruction to move students forward and support them, given their broad range of expertise and experiences that they bring to us? So let's keep going. We then move into those 3 principles there. You can see that of UDL, the what of learning, the how of learning, the why of learning. And then in the guide, we provide a little bit more detail about each step. So of course, we start with planning. And in this case, it's a learning segment template that tells us a lot of detail from about 3 to 5 lessons and about the 3 assessments that they're going to engage in with their students. And they plan all that out in step 1 in a
And the
template
rubrics,
called,
and the rubrics.
so let's keep going. After step 1 plan, we come to step 2, teach and assess. And in step 2, they are up on their feet teaching and assessing. So those 3 to 5 lessons, and they're video recording all of this instruction, and they will go back and pick and select clips of their practice, and then they will go into those clips inside the system and annotate them. And they will show us how they are assessing student learning and developing academic language. Academic language may be something you want to highlight here. We need to see how the language that is necessary to learn the content, how is that being taught? How are students supported to learn that academic language? How are students using educational technology to further their understanding of content? Another annotation, followed by content-specific feedback to students. So those rubrics that were submitted in step 1, how is that content-specific, rubric-specific feedback given to students so students know what they are doing well and what they need to continue to work on? And then finally, assessing student learning and use of higher order thinking. So we want our students engaged in analysis, synthesis. We want to see them transfer their understanding from one situation to another. So how and in what circumstances are we seeing students having the opportunity to engage in higher order thinking? So important. So that's step 2, teach and assess those 3 to 5 lessons, show us those 3 assessments. And then we get into step 3, reflect. In step 3, the candidates are going to take a close look at that formal assessment set of results, also think about their informal assessments and their student self-assessment. And then coming into step 4, they will determine whether they are going to reteach a lesson or reteach to the learning goals put forward in those 3 to 5 lessons, or whether they're going to provide an extension activity beyond those lessons that we saw them teach and assess, because in fact their students have demonstrated across these 3 types of assessments that they've reached the learning goal and they're ready to go on and learn more content. So step 4 is either a reteaching of the whole class or a group of students, or it is an extension activity for students that have in fact met the learning goals and need to be moving forward. The guide we're looking at with you is the multiple subjects guide, and this is just a reminder that candidates must do, multiple subject candidates must do 1 instructional cycle in literacy and 1 instructional cycle in mathematics. So if they started with literacy in cycle 1, they're doing mathematics in cycle 2, or vice versa. If you are a single subject candidate, you're doing both cycles in your content expert area of expertise. And however, the lessons from cycle 1 to cycle 2 must be different. We need candidates to show us the most of their performance that they can, so there is no repeating of a lesson from cycle 1 to cycle 2. So of course, this is all about content-specific pedagogy, and the specific pedagogy is explained in the teaching performance expectations. This is true for multiple subject and single subject candidates. Here you see the multiple subject literacy TPEs and the multiple subject mathematics TPEs, and these are the kinds of pedagogy we expect to see in these instructional cycles. Let's keep going. This is where we come into our evidence table. This is where we just take the same information we just gave that to them in a narrative way, and we put it into a table. So you can see on the far left that it is step 1 plan, and templates are provided for the candidates to complete. Then exactly what you are to do if you are the candidate, step by step. And then in the far right column, what evidence will be submitted. So you can see here in cycle 2, step 1, there is a lot required of the candidate. We need a written narrative to understand the contextual information. Who are the students you're teaching? What assets do they have? What learning needs need to be taken into account when planning instruction? Then part B is that learning segment template where they tell us all about those 3 to 5 lessons and show us what content they're teaching, what ELD standards are being put into the lessons and also potentially assessed, And how is all that going to happen? Where are those 3 types of assessment going to happen? And then we come down into part C, which is another written narrative where they give us the descriptions of their 3 types of assessment. Part D, E, and F ask for blank copies of the informal assessment in a rubric, then a blank copy of the student self-assessment in a rubric, and finally a blank copy and a rubric of the formal assessment. So a lot gets submitted in step 1. Let's keep going. Take a quick look at steps 2, 3, and 4, which are laid out here in the table. Again, step 2 is where they're up on their feet teaching and assessing those lessons and then picking clips and annotating them. Step 3 is when they are looking very closely at that formal assessment data as well as the assessment data from the informal and student self-assessment and determining, have my students demonstrated through these assessments that they have met or exceeded or not yet met the learning goals. And based on that, in step 4, they either reteach in a new way the whole group or a small group from the class, or they provide an extension lesson in step 4. Laura, you want to move forward to step 4? And then, of course, they can submit that 5th clip where they are reteaching. So there are 5 video clips in total in cycle 2. So then once the chart is provided for them and hopefully is helpful, we move on and start getting into the specifics of each step. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to James, who's going to walk us through step 1 and talk to us about what is measured in step 1 by looking at those essential questions.
Thank you, Amy. And again, when we look at the different steps, of which there are 4, as a reminder, we're going to do it at a very high level and then get into a little bit more specifics with our lead assessors who are joining us on the call. So in the plan section, as Amy said, there are a number of steps in the plan because, as we all know, teaching involves a great deal of planning, knowing about students, and being able to think about what instructional strategies and content-specific pedagogy will be able to support the students in the lesson. So the first thing that candidates are asked to do is to get to know their students. So if we could scroll down just a little bit, and there are templates that candidates can utilize in order to be able to get to know their students. They may transfer any applicable information from the Cycle 1 Getting to Know Your Students template to the Cycle 2 Contextual Information. So they can do that, but note that last sentence in the green callout box: do not resubmit the Cycle 1 Getting to Know Your Students template for Cycle 2, and do not use the same lesson for cycles 1 and 2. That's an important item that you may want to highlight or star. Again, as Amy said, you candidates are asked to gather information about students' assets and learning needs. So things that they will take into consideration are prior academic knowledge related to the learning goal. What are the English language proficiencies, which includes both standard English learners and English learners, cultural and linguistic resources and funds of knowledge. Continuing forward, prior experience and interest related to the content, and experience using educational technology, including assistive technologies inside and outside of the classroom. There is a call-out box that defines standard English learner because there were a number of questions about who are standard English learners. So this is a definition that may be helpful. And then here, the candidate provides contextual information for the class. So the grade level, the content area, the classroom setting, the educational technology or appropriate assistive technologies available, the number of students, then subdividing that, the total number, identified English learners, standard English learners, students with an IEP, number of students with a 504 plan, and or number of students identified as gifted and talented. Notice that there is a note: if IEP, 504 plan, and or GATE are not applicable for your students given their age, such as a TK through 3 classroom. Again, identifying dual language, if that is appropriate, whether it's bilingual, one-way immersion, or two-way immersion, and the topic of the content-specific instruction and the sequence of the assessments. Continuing, candidate then works through the learning segment, plan a content-specific learning segment that includes a sequence of instruction and assessment across 3 to 5 lessons drawn from a larger unit. And that instruction and assessment sequence must include an informal assessment, at least one opportunity for student self-assessment, and then of course a formal assessment. With these assessments, there will be a corresponding rubric to provide feedback to students during instruction and potentially to adjust instruction. And again, as a reminder that the formal assessment must require students to create and or produce a product, a process, or a performance. Continuing. As candidates are completing the learning segment template, first order of importance is the California Content Standard being addressed. It must be a California state adopted current content standard. If there are English language learners in the classroom, the California ELD standards must be identified as well. The learning goal that is to be guiding the lesson, the evidence and assessments, what will students be able to demonstrate to show that they have achieved the learning goal, and then what is going to be the assessment activity for the lesson, which includes the informal student self-assessment and formal assessment. Continuing. Oh, I'm sorry, just up a little bit more. Yes, how does it fit? How does the lesson links to where students currently are? What are the learning activities and the instructional activities that will be provided? How will the candidate address the demands of language, such as English language development and academic language development? What might be adaptations that need to be made in order to help students address academic language development? And then number 8, the instructional adaptations that the candidate will use to support the range of learners in the class. So with assessment descriptions, candidates will provide a high-level description of their assessment. This again includes the informal assessment, the student self-assessment, and the formal. And they must also provide the rubrics that they will use. Okay, continuing. So here's information about the informal assessment, the student self-assessment, and the formal assessment. So there are call-out boxes about the specificity for each one of the assessments that candidates would definitely want to read. Continuing. And then here we are with the evidence to be submitted. A written narrative, which is the contextual information. Part B, learning segment template. Part C, the written narrative, which includes the assessment descriptions. And again, remember about the page requirements because those are important. The Part D, the description or blank copies of both the informal assessment instrument and the corresponding rubrics. Part E, the description or blank copies of both the student self-assessment and the corresponding rubric. And finally, Part F, a description or blank copies of both the formal assessment instrument and corresponding rubric. Again, step 1 plan is a great deal of information, but again, it lays the foundation for all the other pieces of evidence that the candidate utilizes throughout cycle 2. So Lori, if you could take us down to the essential questions. I just want to go over the essential questions as they apply to step 1. Oh, there we go. So there are 2 rubrics in step 1, and these are the essential questions for step 1. Thank you, Beth. Yes. Single subject, we're on page 26. So, essential question, how does the candidate's learning segment plan provide appropriate content-specific and, if appropriate, ELD learning goal or goals and assessments that offer multiple ways for all students to demonstrate knowledge? Second essential question, how does the candidate plan a learning segment in which assessments, instructional strategies, and learning activities align and provide a progression of learning that develops students' concepts and skills to achieve the learning goals? When I went through and showed the evidence to be submitted, when an assessor is reviewing these 2 rubrics, they look at all those different levels of evidence to be submitted when seeing how it corresponds to the rubric. So all of those pieces of evidence do correspond to these essential questions and the rubrics. So now what I'd like us to do, Lori, if you take us to the PowerPoint, and we can begin with the PowerPoint slide 16. We showed this picture or this graphic yesterday, and again, it's just to have, and feel free to utilize this with your candidates or folks with whom you're working on the CalTPA, but it gives more information about this asset model of education. What is important here is that candidates understand about not going from a deficit model, but instead focusing on the assets of students. All students bring an asset to the classroom that teachers can then build upon in securing content knowledge with their students. So we really want everyone to understand what that means. And so in turn, next slide, looking at the ELD standards that correspond to the planning, is how does the idea of these implementation of the literacy, English language, and the ELD instruction work? So how would a candidate amplify their content or literacy with these levels of ELD instruction, such as making meaning, effective expression, foundational skills, content knowledge, and also language development? So I'm about to turn it over to Beth and Mick. So the next thing we'd like you to do is, as an audience, think about these 2 questions as we talk about tips and considerations. The first one is, think about what should faculty instructors keep in mind when preparing candidates for submission of this step, and what are some tips you may have for your own faculty and instructors that might help in stronger candidate submissions. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Beth and Mick and have them give some tips for success with regard to step 1. And we have some ideas here, and I'll let them elaborate on them now. So Beth and Mick, it is over to you.
Beth, do you want to start?
I'm sorry. Sure. Let's take a look at the first bullet. As you work through the prompts, commentary, and templates, take time to map your responses back to the prompts and to the rubrics. And these are worded for candidates. So one thing that we found really helpful, and this is an overall step, but especially important for step 1, is that the candidates are taking their written responses and even side by side having the rubrics with them, as well as looking at those prompts and seeing if they can take something they've written and put it back into the rubric construct or into the prompt. And I always think of this as sort of like visual, almost moving pieces around to the right places. And if you've got pieces of information in the right places, then you're probably pretty good to go. They had mentioned earlier the idea of cycle 1, you're providing a context and getting to know your students, but or I mean cycle 2, but it's a little bit different than cycle 1. Identified focus students. And so that is something for them to keep in mind as well, that this is sort of a broader brush stroke approach for cycle 2 and the context, but it's still rooted in the idea of assets being leveraged to support student needs. Using the language of the prompts kind of goes along with that idea that, you know, this is something I, as an English teacher, when you're teaching writing a lot, you tell, you know, students to kind of take a look at that prompt and spin some of it back into their writing. And that's not necessarily just a trick for, you know, high school students to write a 5-paragraph essay. What it does do is it allows the candidate to realize that if they're reusing that language in the response, then they're more likely to actually address what the prompt is asking them for. You want to take the next couple, Nick?
Sure. Okay, so you want to go, it says go beyond simply explaining what you're doing, but provide the how and why. The more information that you put into your templates, the more information that is there describing what's going on, the better they can be evaluated. Because remember, the people who are evaluating weren't there when the kids did these lessons, weren't there when you were helping them work with them. So the more detailed and the more information provided always makes for a better response than very short or limited responses. Number 2, the next one, you know, provide grouping strategies and rationales, particularly in online settings. One thing that we found in science, and I think others when talking with other subject areas as well, that a lot of times this was left off and it wasn't there. And so it would bring down a very good response because the grouping strategies were missing. And grouping and active learning is a big part of what we're trying to promote here. And so, you know, we want to make sure that that's in there. Now, in the new template that you'll get for number 2, for the learning center, there is now a box to talk about grouping strategies. And so you want to make sure that there's a rationale and a reason why you're doing it. And the one last one I'll talk about, and then I'll turn the last one over to Beth, but is to provide student rubrics for the informal assessment, student self-assessment, and formal assessment. That's very important. And as there was in the chat earlier, you want to make sure that the rubrics are covering the content, you know, and it's not just the process. And that a rubric is a rubric. It's not a grading scale. It's not an answer key. It's not a checklist. It's an actual rubric that was created for these assessments that you're turning in. And I can give one quick example. In science, a lot of the kids turn in what they call a CER, a claims, evidence, rationale paper for their formal assessment. But their rubric will come in and say, the CER was completed. The CER used complete sentences. The CER was done on time. And nowhere in that rubric did it talk about what the CER was trying to teach them. There was no content. And so you want to make sure that that's covering the content and not just the process.
Okay.
And take the last one.
I'm sure. Then include ELD goals when students who are English learners are identified in the class context. So it's never going to hurt for your candidates to include ELD goals. And if an assessor sees that there are even 1 or 2 English learners or standard English learners in the class and there are no ELD goals at all, that's going to be a problem. So it's always a great idea to put that information in those ELD goals in for English learners. It also benefits kids who may have been recently reclassified as well. And just a quick little reminder that make sure that your candidates are clear about the meaning of standard English learners. A lot of times they'll say, well, I have 5 ELD students and then everybody else is a standard English learner, and that's not the case. A standard English learner is somebody whose first language is English, but they may not be able to easily master the academic language that is used in the discourse in a school setting. I think that's it for now.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Beth and Mick, for sharing your insights. We'll go on to step 2. Keep putting your questions in the chat. We'll keep trying to respond. And of course, we'll have some time for Q&A exchange later in the presentation. So step 2, here we are. Step 2, cycle 2. The candidate is now teaching and assessing. So this is the performance live performance part of the cycle, and they are encouraged to record everything so that they have lots of options for picking their video clips. So here we are, step 2, teach and assess. The first thing they're asked to do is conduct that learning segment. So go ahead and teach and implement and administer those assessments and work with your students. And so we're going to see as we go on here directions around that. The first call out box we have is the fact that students typically need to be taught how to do student self-assessment. This is not something that students know how to often do just on their own unless they happen to be coming through a set of educational experiences where they've done a lot of critiquing of their own work. So yes, the candidate must be able to conduct and show the students how to do the self-assessment, and that rubric needs to be clearly modeled. How does the individual student use that model? So that's what that first box is about. Let's keep going. They're going to go in now that they've recorded everything, and they have there are 4 clips that they're going to identify. Now, the clips can come from anywhere across the 3 to 5 lessons. And the first one looks at instruction and assessment of academic language development. Also important to highlight, video clips cannot be more than 5 minutes. Video clips that are submitted that are longer than 5 minutes, assessors are trained not to watch beyond the 5 minutes. So important to help your students make sure that they are submitting video clips and putting in their annotations within that first 5 minutes. So in this first clip, again, they're looking at the instruction and assessment of academic language development. In the second clip, we're asking the candidate to show us students, multiple students using educational technology. So again, if you have a highlighter in your hand, that word multiple, which is right in front of the word students there, select a clip from the learning segment that shows multiple students. Please highlight that. Multiple means more than one. All students should have access to the ed tech, not just a few students in the class. So how is it that your students are having access to ed tech, and how are they using it? So here it is very important that we're seeing students using educational technology to further their content knowledge, Just coming onto Zoom, like you are on Zoom with me today, does not mean that the students that are coming onto Zoom because their teacher has said come onto Zoom because we're doing virtual learning, does not show us students using ed tech to further their content knowledge per se. So they really need to be very careful about that and be very clear as they show us students using ed tech. We'll talk more about ed tech and online virtual settings as we get on into the presentation. That brings us to video clip 3. In video clip 3, we need to see the candidate showing us how they provided, I'm sorry, there's a plane going by, so I'm just going to pause for a second. Okay, so in clip 3, the candidate is going to show us how they provided opportunities for students with an S, it's more than one student, to engage in deep learning of content to develop higher order thinking. So that analysis, where are students doing analysis? Where are they doing synthesizing? Are they evaluating or interpreting data? What are they doing? Are they transferring their knowledge from one context to another? We need to see that. And we need to see the candidate. This is, again, an important point here that some of our candidates miss, should highlight this. We need to see the candidate providing feedback to individuals or groups of students or the whole class. And we need to see that candidate adjusting their instruction based on what they're learning from those informal checks for understanding. So they're teaching some aspect of science and the students aren't getting it. So what is the teacher doing to switch directions, to try another way to give those kids access to that all important content? All right, so that's clip 3. Clip 4, now we're looking at how the student is moving through that self-assessment process. So we need to see the student and the teacher, and we need to see how the teacher is modeling how to do the self-assessment for the student and how to use that rubric. That is a very important part of this video clip, and that's that second sentence there. A little more information for you in the green pullout box. Again, videos may not be edited, and also important here at the bottom, candidates and students must be visible in video clips 1, 3, and 4. For video clip 2, Students must be visible using ed tech, and the candidate may or may not be in the video. This is the only video clip where we don't need to see the candidate. We do need to see the students using educational technology. All right, let's keep going. Annotation titles now across those 4 clips. Remember, those 4 clips can come from anywhere in the 3 to 5 lessons. The 4 annotation titles: assessing student learning and development of academic language. Where are they developing language to access the content? Again, where are those students using ed tech? Students using ed tech. And then content specific feedback to candidates, to students. Where are the candidates showing us how they're giving feedback to students on their work so that the students know what they're doing well and what they need to keep working on to advance their learning. Scroll down a little for me. Our 4th annotation is assessing student learning and that use of higher order thinking. Higher order thinking. And then this, of course, leads them to that determination about reteaching or an extension. Some pull-out box comes next, just again about these video clips. We do want to point out, you may want to highlight this, the annotation is so important to the video clip they're showing us, and they're time stamping a segment of the 5-minute clip to show us exactly where they're doing what we've asked to see. And they get 1,000 characters to tell us about that. And in that annotation, they want to tell us what they're doing and why they're doing it. And then, of course, they'll label those so that we can be clear about what they are showing us. Let's keep going. So that brings us down here to this final analysis then of what happened. What did you learn when you did that informal checking for understanding and your students assessed their own work? So we have 3 prompts here that the candidates respond to in a template. First one is looking at how informal assessment results were used to learn about and support students' academic language development and how they adjusted their instruction based on those results. The second prompt takes a look at that in the moment informal assessment and student self-assessment, looking at both of those types of assessment and how the student improved or revised their work to help the kids understand what to do next and how they adjusted their instruction. So again, informal self-assessment, student self-assessment, if you're determining that your students aren't getting the content you're teaching, if they're not approaching that learning goal, what are you doing differently to adjust your instruction to help them access that content? Prompt number 3, how did the student self-assessment results specifically provide insight to you about the student's understanding of content? And if appropriate, those ELD learning goals if you have English learners in your class. And how are they progressing to meet that learning goal? Again, how did you adjust your instruction based on the results? So important prompts there, all on a template for the candidates. Evidence to be submitted is always the last section of each step. Part G4, annotated video clips. Again, each clip, no more than 5 minutes, and then that written narrative. So let's just quickly look at the rubrics. Now, this is a really important component in Cycle 2, and you'll see when we get to our table that we have 5 particular rubrics to assess the work in Teach and Assess. We're looking at 3 to 5 lessons of instruction. We're looking at 3 types of assessment. This is rich data. We have 5 rubrics. 2.3, how does the candidate support student development and demonstration of academic language in relation to the content-specific learning goal, right? So important to build that language. We're going to do some assessment of how the candidate's doing that. Rubric 2.4, how does the candidate incorporate ed tech? How are they using that? How are their students using ed tech to learn the content? And that's an important rubric. 2.5, how does the candidate use informal assessment now? Particularly informal assessment, checking for understanding as they move through instruction to monitor students' deep understanding of content and that higher order thinking and adjusting their instruction. And then 2.6, how does the candidate engage students in self-assessment now, specifically the self-assessment component to build the students' awareness of what they've learned and to support, again, progress towards meeting those content-specific learning goals. 2.7 is our 5th rubric in this step, and we're looking at how the candidate uses the results. of informal assessment and student self-assessment to provide feedback to students to know, so the students know how to improve or revise their work, right? So important for that feedback to be going from the candidate, the instructor, to the students, so that there is an ongoing dialogue and understanding of what do we know, what do we need to still work on to learn, how are we approaching those learning goals. So those are the 5 rubrics that we look at in step 2, teach and assess. So let's go back now. We're going to take you back to our experts, back to Beth and Mick, who are going to be talking with you about some insights for step 2 as you're working to support your students through teaching those 3 to 5 lessons and conducting those types of assessment. So again, next slide. We'll just go ahead and move to our experts. So again, Beth and Mick, over to you to add some more to our thinking.
I'll take on this first one since I think I'm the one that submitted it. If something goes wrong in the video, please encourage your candidates to deal with it in the commentary, in the annotations. What happens often is there'll be something that's obviously wrong and the candidate won't address it at all. So we have no idea as assessor whether they noticed that something was going wrong or not. Or maybe they did and they did something about it and we just didn't see what the response was. So, and sometimes a candidate will not select the video that is the most ideal to demonstrate the evidence of what the rubrics are asking because there's something in the video that they don't like. But since the video clips can't be annotated or edited rather, sometimes they'll just totally not do anything with it at all. So if it's better for them to, you know, we all realize that things go on in a classroom as long as it's nothing really horrible. They're really better off if it's strong evidence for the rubrics to have that in there and explain in the annotations and go from there. Mick, do you want to handle the next one?
Sure, be glad to. Okay, so the annotations should explain what is happening in the timestamp video and should provide a rationale. The annotations need to match the timestamp, and it should say what's going on in that time period and why you're doing it and how. And I also like to tell people, and how does it match the annotation title? How does that fit into the title that's selected for that particular annotation? One thing that we find that people do that isn't good or doesn't really help is that they'll say things like, before the clip, I did all these great things, you know, and I went over everything and went over the instructions and I did all these things that it says it's supposed to, but you can't see it. Well, you know, the annotations have to match what's on the screen, right? So it's got to be, this is the time, and when I click on that button to go look at what's in that segment, I want to see exactly what you're talking about, because they can do that. Now, when you are assessing, you can watch the whole thing and check it out, or after you've done that, a lot of the assessors will go back, because if you hit the timestamp, that little portion of the clip will play for the assessor, and they will look to make sure that that exactly is what they're seeing and why. And so those things really have to match. That's important. Beth, you want to take the last one?
Sure. And I can't agree with Mick even more. I mean, it's so important that they're talking about what you actually see in the video. If you don't see it in the video, then they probably should have selected something different. Also, one of the things that they're being asked to do is really provide continuity on what is going to be happening next to continue progress toward content-specific learning goals. I think this is true in both cycle 1 and cycle 2 in the video clips, and the emphasis should always be on content-specific goals, learning goals, not what they are going to do next structurally or, you know, within the confines of the classroom or the online activity transition or whatever. That all of these really need to be focused on the content.
Right. You want to make sure that all those lessons are flowing together. And so you want to see that this is the next step. You know, this is what I'm going to do in the next lesson. You know, that's always important. Absolutely.
I think
okay.
that's.
I think we're good there.
Okay, so I'm going to get us into step 3, which is the reflect. So Lori, if we could go back to the guide, I'm going to walk us fairly quickly through step 3 so that we can have enough time for our other items in this presentation. So in step 3, the reflect, what candidates are asked to do is to analyze the formal assessment responses. And in doing so, they're going to pick 3 student responses, and they are going to be a product, process, or recorded performance that 1, exceeded the learning goal, 2, met the learning goal, or in the case of student response 3, did not yet meet the learning goal. And continuing down, what the candidate is going to do is to analyze this data. Go to the next page, I'm sorry, Lori. And oh, there we go. They're going to look at this particular template, and they are going to analyze the data, the formal assessment results in relation for the whole class in relation to the content specific learning goals, and look at how these trends, these patterns that they're noticing, both in understanding the whole class and the 3 students, represent that full range of performance. And what they want to do is they want to cite evidence. This is going to be something that you're going to hear Mick and Beth refer to when they get to tips on this particular step is citing evidence. And it needs to be assessment evidence from what they have analyzed. Continuing, they look at, based on the rubric, what type of feedback will they provide. So if we could scroll up a little bit there, Lori, thank you. And what will you provide to student 1, student 2, student 3? And then also what will you provide to the whole class? And then another question is, how will you assist the whole class and these students, these individuals, to use the feedback to revise their work and or take next steps to advance their learning? So now looking at data, looking at assessment results to reflect and determine, okay, what are my next steps? How am I going to advance this learning? So in terms of the evidence to be submitted, which is just down just a little bit, is that part I, those formal assessment responses from the 3 students that represent evidence of learning, and they must be labeled exceeded, met, or not yet met. And then also part J, the written analysis, which is the analysis of the formal assessment results. Okay, so if we could go down to our essential questions, Lori, and I'll just walk through these and then turn it back over to our to Mick and Beth. So you'll see that step 3 only has 1 rubric and 1 essential question, which is, how does the candidate analyze the formal assessment results based on the rubric and identify and describe emerging learning patterns and trends for the whole class and determine what was most and least effective in relation to the learning goal or goals? So in going back to our slide deck, there's a slide that I'd like to begin. It'll be slide 27, looking at reflective writing and some ideas to take into consideration. And we provide this to you as a resource. It's the next one. There we go. Thinking about what reflective writing asks candidates to do, it is a processing phase in which they can communicate their learning in light of their experiences. And thinking of this upside down triangle, where they really start with the assessment results and really go down to ultimately what they do as a teacher and what they can do to help students with getting to the learning goal. So in our next step, why don't we go to Mick and Beth can talk about the tips for success with regard to step 3.
Well, I guess I could take the first one there. So what tips do you have to help candidates analyze students' assessment data and write about it effectively? I think one thing to choose, make sure that the students are analyzing the goals. They've written these goals, and so maybe start with an outline. What did I do to evaluate these goals? What were the results that I found? And then when you craft a response, then they can group it that way, so that on the first one, my students did this, and these students did these certain things. But you want to be able to describe those goals and how their students did on those goals. So I think that's really important, is to organize it, make sure you know where was it evaluated and what the results were, and then write the response.
To kind of circle around on that a little bit, one of the things I frequently see is that the candidates haven't necessarily carefully aligned the learning goals that they're covering in the formal assessment with, or let's say the purposes of the formal assessment with the learning goals in the lesson segment, the learning segment that is leading up to that. And so really those pieces should be together. Whatever they're teaching in the lessons that are moving up to that formal assessment should be directly reflected in the rubric that is being used to judge the formal assessment. And so that way all of the pieces fit together. Sometimes they're kind of like random. And so when they start discussing the learning goals, they're not always the goals of the formal assessment, and also sometimes that can be problematic. Just in addition, sometimes candidates don't provide the feedback, either the rubric that was used to score the performance or the product, or they don't provide any kind of feedback at all. So they should really be careful about following those instructions, so that they're including the work itself and the feedback that they provided to the student about that work. And in this particular case, those 3 samples plus the larger aggregate data give the candidate a whole lot of fodder for making reflective decisions about what worked and what didn't. And they really need to address both the big picture, what worked, what didn't, and for those 3 students in particular.
Right.
I see a lot of people also addressing just the deficits, what the students didn't do well, but not giving student feedback or not really honoring what the students did right, which does give you something to build on to continue to address their needs. So sometimes that gets left out of that whole process. And then there's a whole picture of idea of making sure that they're referring to evidence, and the evidence that you're referring to is certainly the student work and the rubrics and the scores, and also bringing in some of the ideas about the lesson that was taught and how it was enacted or reflected in the formal assessment results.
Right. You don't want, and even the feedback, that feedback part of my feedback is that. The other thing too about the patterns and trends, it's good. You want them to be reflective, and so if things aren't going well, you don't want to fake it and say, oh, they did really well, but oh wait, this was a goal that they didn't meet very well, and in the future I need to do this to make it better. You want to describe not only hopefully it'll go well, and yeah, I'm going to do this, but if it's not going well, your reflection should reflect the results that you got, and not trying to make it different. And then be specific. The more specific you are, and the better it's going to be. We get that a lot of times when we'll get general stuff like, overall the class did really well, or I think they did okay, but they're not specific, right? So on goal 1, or on this assessment, on this thing, this is what they did, and be specific. Again, the more specific you are, the easier it is to understand what you're trying to get across.
Great advice from Mick and Beth. Thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and move to step 4, which is, of course, the step in which we begin to wrap up and pull together all the components of the instructional cycle. So step 4, apply. How will the candidate apply what they've learned? So in this case, they're looking at informal assessment, student self-assessment results, and formal assessment results from all the students in their class. They're thinking about the whole class. They're thinking about the individuals, and they're determining, do I need to reteach because my students have not yet met the learning goal, or one of the learning goals, perhaps if they have multiple learning goals, or have my students demonstrated across these three measures, right? The important underlying concept here is that we need to be looking at multiple measures as teachers before we make a decision about what we're doing next for instruction. So across our three measures, how are the students doing in light of the learning goals set? And what should I do? Should I reteach in a new way, right? Because reteaching and saying it louder or going more slowly is not probably a great strategy. We want to see teachers try another set of strategies to help students access that content. So it could be for the whole class, remember, it could be for a small group, or perhaps your group really has met across those three measures, informal, student, self, and formal. They have met the learning goal. Fantastic. So that doesn't mean we stop. That means we keep going. So we give them more. We challenge them. We get them into that higher order thinking. So that's what we're looking for in step 4. They are going to do some more teaching. It's a new, we don't call it a full-blown lesson. We call it an activity. But what are they going to do next to have students interact with that content and keep learning and or help them learn what they were to learn in the prior lessons? So that's what this is about. They will also annotate this video clip. It too is up to 5 minutes. And they're going to show us exactly how they're reteaching and or extending the learning for the group or the whole class. And they do have some reflective writing here in this last step. And then we move on to our rubrics then. What are we looking at? We have one rubric here for step 4, apply. We are particularly now looking at how the candidate uses that analysis of results from those 3 types of assessment, right? Informal checking for understanding throughout the 3 lessons. The student themselves telling them whether they think they know or don't know what they're learning, and that formal assessment, that process, product, or performance. We're looking at that. We're teaching a follow-up activity, or which is either an extension or a reteach, and then we're providing a rationale. The candidate is providing a rationale for the activity choice. And citing evidence. What does citing evidence mean? That means their discussion in the narrative in step 4 must reflect what happened in the 3 lessons, the 3 assessments, and with this group of students. We like them to go backwards into step 1 and look at their evidence, step 2 in their videos and annotations, step 3 in their reflective writing, and tell us and pull forward that evidence of their own teaching practice to be able to respond to the prompts here in step 4. And that wraps up cycle 2. So let's go back now and hear from our experts again, Beth and Mick. What can you say about this final step and what you're seeing, and what advice do you have?
Okay, again, citing evidence, explicit or implicit. I guess the big point here is we're not asking people to cite research. We're not asking them to say on page so-and-so of my template. But we are asking them to use that whole body of the work that they've been doing to really support the choice for their follow-up activity. Sometimes what we'll see is somebody will just say, oh, I'm going to do a reteaching on this because the students need it. Well, what gives you that impression that the students need it? We need to kind of see what's going on in the teacher's head, in the candidate's head, to figure out why did they make that choice. And so that's really important for them to be talking about the previous steps and what they have done in the whole instructional package that led them to deciding that they needed to make that particular activity their follow-up.
Hey.
Mick, anything to add to that?
No, I think that's really good. That's really good, Beth. Number 2 says build a reteach extension activity that is not part of step 1 learning segment elements. Yeah, what you got to remember is that this is done, it should be done after you've given the formal assessment and did all the assessments for the unit. This is what comes after, not before. And so what people have done is taken a lesson that they did in step 1 and stuck it into that video 4 and saying this is the lesson. But this is a new lesson. It's a new one based on the results of from your step 3. You know, do I need to reteach? Do I need an extension? And if it's an extension, it's got to build on the content, make it more difficult, go into more detail. If it's a new one, like Amy said earlier, it's a new way to teach it. This is these content, these people really need to learn this again, and I need to do it a different way. So this is done last. You know, it's not something you do before. This is probably the last thing your students should be working on after they've done all the first 3 steps, so they know what to do in 4.
Good point. Yeah, we do see that a lot where the candidate has just taken the last lesson in the series and that's their reteach or their extension, and that's not what the point is. This is, again, seeing what kind of instructional decisions they are making based on the evidence they have. The other thing, and this last point is really something that applies everywhere, not just to step 4. And this is, you know, a lot of times candidates, and not even necessarily so much about the CalTP, but just in general, you know, they complain about the fact that they are being asked the same thing over and over again. And if a candidate feels this way, what we encourage them to do is take a real careful look at those prompts. An assessor really doesn't want to read what was cut and pasted between 2 places 4 times, you know. It's like that's really not what we're looking for. What we really need to see is each of the rubrics, and it is a shade of meaning sometimes. There is a difference from one to the next. We are asking for a different level of detail if it seems like it's something that has been asked again. So it's really going to take some close reading skills of those candidates to figure out what is different between the prompts and make sure that their response is appropriate to that particular prompt. And it doesn't just copy and throw in everything hoping that the assessor will find the right stuff.
And writing the prompts is very important. You know, they should answer the question that's being asked. And so reading it, thinking about it, and then answering is always important.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Beth and Mick. We will come back and ask for more expertise from you as we go on, but we're going to move ahead. We have a little bit over half an hour left with you. And we're going to take a quick look at the rubric layout and format so that we're all familiar with how these analytic rubrics work. So please go to the next slide for me. All right, so we just wanted to quickly make sure for those of you who are just joining us in this important work, how these analytic rubrics work. They are all provided to the candidate in the back of the guide. They should be used in courses, used in discussion, and read carefully. So each rubric has its title. So this is rubric 2.4. You can see it's step 2. In our step 2 is, of course, teach and assess. We always have our essential question provided at the top of the rubric because, again, this is what we're measuring. We are looking at how the candidate incorporates ed tech to provide opportunities for students. So important highlight for students to achieve or demonstrate the content-specific learning goals. Assessors are trained to start by reading level 3 and looking at the constructs and expectations laid out in the rubric level for level 3, and then matching that back to the evidence provided. So in this case, in level 3, we're seeing the candidate providing students opportunities to use ed tech to achieve or demonstrate the content-specific learning goal. Level 2 is when the teacher is completely responsible, the candidate is responsible, and it's a one-to-many type learning using ed tech. So they are using ed tech, but it is me presenting to you, telling you what to do, how to do it, and I'm the one in charge of everything. That's going to be a score of a level 2. So a candidate calling their students into Zoom and then proceeding on with lecturing, that's a level 2. Great. They're on Zoom. They're not really using that ed tech to further their content individually. When we start seeing students in the class using ed tech, using Google, working together on a document, creating a music video together, etc., using robots and science, conducting online science investigations together and using technology to learn content. Now we're at a level 3. When students start having choice about what to do, now we're going up to a level 4, right? So another important thing to note here is in level 4 and level 5, only way to get to a level 4 is if the candidate shows us evidence for everything listed in level 3. Everything listed in level 3. Now we can consider, are they a level 4? If they provide evidence for everything in level 4, fantastic. Now we need to consider, are they a level 5? And the only way to get to 5 is to have all the evidence of 3, all of 4, and all of 5. Anything missing, you're dropping back down. So in level 3, if we don't have all the evidence for the level 3 language provided at the level 3 rubric level, you are now being considered at a level 2. And again, if the level 2 constructs are not evidenced in the candidate submission, now they're probably going to fall into a level 1, which is our lowest category of evidence response. Now, at the bottom of the rubric, it's important to note, we tell you which TPEs and elements are measured. And remember, for those of you in teacher prep and those of you who are in induction, our 6 main area domains are exactly the same now from teacher prep into induction. So these elements and TPEs should make sense. And then sources of evidence. So right here, this is so important. At the bottom of each rubric, it is identified exactly what the assessor looks at and only looks at to make the score judgment for that rubric. So for this rubric, the only thing the assessor looks at are the 4 annotated video clips. And once they review those video clips and read those annotations, then they come back and make a score judgment about whether or not they had the evidence in relationship to students using ed tech to further their content specific learning. So this is how our rubrics are laid out. Let's keep going. So we were going to pause here for Q&A, but I think we've been answering them in the chat. So we're going to keep going and we're going to get back to this. We have some more important information we want to make sure that we get to, because you have been asking lots of questions about online learning and any flexibilities that might be in place. Here was the break we were going to have. And here's our cute little otter. Maybe James, you could just turn this on for a second. This is a great thing to do. It's free. It's from the Monterey Aquarium, and it's the otters actually live, and we can
with their refurbished living arrangements. But yes, this if you haven't already done so, the Monterey Bay Aquarium has a number of different channels that are live. They have the jellyfish, they have their shark tank. It's really, really great. I put it on a lot of times when I'm working with my own children, and we watch this as a break, just to get their eyes out of Zoom.
So anyway, we do, however, want to invite you to please take a break if you need one. We understand we've been online with you for an hour and a half. We will continue, but do step away and come back to us if you need that break. But we are going to continue on. And now we're going to come into our tips for completing cycle 2, tips in addition to what we've already shared. So we're going to keep going. Next slide, please.
And now I will talk about tips for preparing and checking cycle 2. So things that we have found that have been very beneficial to candidates is to consult the acceptable support resource that is on the CTC exams website that I believe Amy and Lori have put into the chat periodically throughout this presentation, but maybe Lori, if you could just put it in right now since I am referring to it. And there are pieces of acceptable support that you can provide to candidates. It has been an urban legend out there that if a student or a candidate is participating in the CalTPA, that they are hands-off, you can't do anything. That is simply not true. Just like anything that someone would be working on in college or in school, you of course can't plagiarize, you can't provide them with a bank of different submissions and say, here, pick one and go for it. But giving candidates the opportunity to peer edit each other's work, coaching them through the process is certainly supportive and crucial to this performance assessment. Provide dedicated time for that peer review and for other candidates to share work and look at each other's submissions, again, reminding them that they must submit their own work and that it is crucial that they make sure that their work does not look or read like another candidate's, or that will cause a flag to go up as possible plagiarism. Schedules coaching sessions with candidates to ask reflective questions would be very helpful. One of our lead assessors yesterday in the cycle 1 suggested utilizing the essential questions that are in the rubrics, or perhaps the rubric constructs themselves, as those types of self-assessment questions that might be very helpful to the candidates. So moving forward to the next piece, preparing and checking cycle 2. Some things that you would want to do with candidates is to provide locally designed reflection guides to help review. There we go. And also provide opportunities for candidates to look at the rubric criteria and apply it to a peer submission or even to their own submission as a form of self-reflection. If a candidate does need remediation, in the next slide, there are some areas of assistance that you can provide. The first one is, it is an emotional experience that if a candidate has to resubmit, they may be feeling upset, disillusioned. And so again, we have to take on the role of therapist at times and really walk them through that. But that's okay in order to help them get their mindset back where it needs to be. It's kind of like talking to them when they've had a difficult day with students or a lesson and just saying, it's going to happen. What do we need to focus on to move forward? Deconstruct the submission again and look at it against the rubric constructs. Encourage that peer review. And then again, as I said, look at the guides to identify what might be missing or off target or could have led an assessment of their submission to be lower than what they had expected. A lot of times candidates will submit things and I will ask, what type of support did you get? Did you have someone read it? And they say, no, I just submitted it. Again, having that coaching, having that peer review is very helpful in assisting them with cycle 2, as well as cycle 1. I'm going to turn it back over to Amy, who's going to start getting us into online settings. I know many of you have had questions about this. So Amy, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thanks, James. So, of course, here we find ourselves in the middle of a pandemic and moving our learning settings to virtual online settings. So, while we do understand that it's challenging, we also want to point out that the assessment stands as it's written and the rubrics remain as the requirements for performance from our candidates. So regardless of whether they're teaching in person or some kind of combination of in-person online or online, it must be synchronous. That's the second icon here, and it must still follow the guides as written. Remember, we are teaching in California, so of course we need to be offering opportunities to learn the California content standards and our frameworks, and we need to be always providing that range of instructional opportunity for our candidates to access, and then also all those ways that we check for understanding throughout. So this all has to continue even if we are in an online environment and setting. And those of you who have also in your own work moved to online settings, you know the pedagogy is very different, and we need to be paying attention to that as we're working in an online setting. So let's go to the next slide, please. Some tips. They must teach the actual students from their class, the class of students they have been assigned and employed to teach. And or if they are in a prep program, they have an agreement, the preparation program has an agreement with that district, then this candidate is working as a student teacher in that classroom and has that that documentation to allow them to do that. So we cannot have candidates working with their friends who are pretending to be students. We cannot go through the neighborhood and gather up a couple of children to work with. It has to be the actual students that the teacher and or the teacher candidate have the opportunity to work with, and it's all sanctioned by the district. The second point we want to make out is that virtual instruction platforms should support the ability to record, and if not, then you need to be holding up your iPhone, and recording yourself in the online setting. We need to see the candidate, we need to see the students, except for that very one video in cycle 2 where we don't need to see the candidate, but we do need to see the students engaging in ed tech. Now, in the third point here, if the evidence cannot be captured in that platform, that was my point about the external camera. But we do have to have video recording. It must be synchronous. We must see the candidate and we must see the students. Next slides, please. General tips for working in online settings. We must, again, we say this a lot. You may think, why are they hammering away on this? We get this question every single day. And yes is the answer. Yes, we must see the candidates. Yes, we must see the students. Many people, again, there's some legend being built up out there that we have to see faces. No, we don't. We haven't said that we have to see the face of people, but it is so helpful to be able to see the face of people, whether you're a student or a candidate. So we don't have to, we just need to see them, some part of them. We know there's a lot of sensitivities. The most important thing here too is that permissions must be in place. Districts and school sites have the legal right to determine everything related to online learning. So this is not something that the commission can determine. It is a local decision. And therefore permissions, as always, even in the past, always have to have permissions to use visual images of students so we can keep them safe as an educational community and other adults. So be very clear that you have permissions in place. Be very certain to guide your candidates to follow the local requirements. And we'll talk in a bit about what are the flexibilities if you can't video record. What if you can't? Okay, we have some suggestions. We'll get to that in a minute. Must be continuous and unedited. And we've talked about that already. And then finally, already, again, same point. Got to follow those district guidelines. So next slide, please. Couple more tips, and all these tips, by the way, are provided in this webinar, but also again on our website for candidates and for all of you supporting our candidates out there. So yes, continuous and unedited, yes. There are a few exceptions. So we know that names pop up under your picture on Zoom or in other platforms. You can go in there and select your 3 little buttons and you can change your name or you can remove your name. And we do hope that candidates are doing that. We want them to do that because students' privacy needs to be protected. However, so if they cover or remove the names, that will not be considered editing. That is only considered safety for our kids, so not a problem. Video captured in an online setting such as Zoom, where it jumps a little bit back and forth, that's okay. We're not going to not score a candidate for that. The use of video captioning is permitted, but only to help clarify the audio. So again, that will be accepted for scoring. The next thing I want to point out is that contextual information template should indicate and briefly describe the online setting. So again, if you're the teacher teaching, we need to know everything about your context and your setting. So the candidate needs to tell us they're teaching in an online environment or whatever the setting and context is for learning. It would be helpful to know that. In the learning segment template in cycle 2, they should describe that pedagogy. As I mentioned, pedagogy online is really different than pedagogy in person. Some things are the same, it's kind of a Venn diagram, but a lot of things are different. And so we'd like to hear about that from the candidate if they're in an online setting as they respond to the prompts. Candidates should continue to provide those blank copies, of course, of the informal, the student self-assessment, and the formal. And these types of assessments can happen in online platforms. So we still need to see that. And we need those 3 rubrics submitted. Finally, they must continue to collect and submit the student formal performances. So whether it's a process, product, or performance, this means, you know, it might be something that the students are writing for their formal and submitting. It might be a performance and there may be video recording of those performances, etc. That whole range of the ways that we do formal assessment, all of it's allowed. All of it can be done online. And yes, we still need to see that student work with that rubric specific feedback. Next slide, please. We are putting this up for you and we want to pause to make sure if you have questions about who needs to be seen in which video clip, here it is. In the first clip, in cycle 2, we need to see 2 or more students and the candidate. When you carefully read the language in the assessment guide, you see the word student, and the word student has an S behind it. That implies more than one. Remember, these assessments were built for whole class instruction. We're expecting to see a group of students. In this case, we're going to say 2 or more students for video clip 1. Video clip 2, 2 or more students. That word multiple, I asked you to highlight it. So important. We need to see more than one student using ed tech. You, the candidate, you don't have to be in this clip, but you can be. It's your option. Video clip 3, 2 or more students and the candidate must be seen. Video clip 4 is a little different. Select a clip of at least one student and the candidate modeling that use of student self-assessment. So in clip 4, this is the only time that we're okay with just one student. When we get to the 5th clip in step 4, where they're reteaching or extending, again, student with an S. So 2 or more students and the candidate. Again, we must see the candidate. So hopefully this is helpful and clears up any confusion as we move forward and we begin to see a lot more instruction happening in online settings. Remember, synchronous instruction is what we need to see. All right, let's keep going. Few additional tips. You can go right here to ctcexams.nesinc.com. Such an important website. Really, you should bookmark this. This is where all your information about policies and the assessment materials are located, as well as guides for online settings. And James, are you up next?
No, actually it's Lori who's going to show everyone how to access materials as we're getting close to our 3 o'clock hour.
We will continue on. Again, if you want to stay at 3 o'clock with us, we will stay on and make sure we have answered all your questions. All right, Lori, back to you.
All right, real quickly here. We went through this at the beginning of the webinar, but for those who may have missed it, all of the assessment materials, including the Cycle 1 and Cycle 2 guides, and all of the templates that candidates use for their submitting their written evidence, those can all be accessed on the CalTPA faculty resource webpage. I will put that in the chat. Oops. Had my cursor sitting in the wrong location. I will put that in the chat window one more time. Those are all available in password protected zip files on the faculty resource webpage. And we've been providing that password in the chat window here, but also program coordinators at your institution should have that information, so you can always check with your program coordinator. Candidates have access to the materials as well when they actually register on the CalTPA submission site to work on their cycles. They have access to all the same materials directly through the system. While we're on that faculty resource page, I also want to point out there's a new resource that was published this year. It is the program guide. This guide was designed specifically for faculty who support candidates. It has a lot of information, tips, and examples for implementing and supporting candidates with the assessments, and also a lot of resources and information useful to help and support faculty. We highly encourage you to download this document. It is located in the same assessments materials section as the guides, as the zip files. And although it is not contained within the zip file, it's just listed just below it. And download this, share it with all of your faculty and staff. Share it with the mentor master teachers working with the candidates in the field. Share it with everybody. Here's another reinforcement of who this guide you might find useful. Coordinators, certainly, instructors, as I said, field supervisors, master mentor teachers. It's a very, very useful tool. Also available on the faculty resource website, down at the bottom, there's a section called CalTPA Secure Materials. This is where you can access there's a link that will take you to the CTC Secure Materials website. And this is where they have posted actual sample submissions. Currently, the submissions are from year 2. We haven't completed our first submission and scoring window yet here for year 3. So the intention is to eventually post some year 3 samples, but for the time being, we have posted samples from year 2. There is a cycle 1 and a cycle 2 example, one multiple subject and one single subject, I believe, science. These materials contain or include all of the candidates' written evidence as well as their video evidence. The information is preceded by a README file, so to speak, with some guiding information that will help you to understand the materials that you are reading. I put these do require a login credentials in order to access those, and I will redo it, put that information in the chat window, username and password. They are case sensitive. So again, these can be downloaded and shared with faculty, staff, and candidates. Of course, if they are shared, they should be posted on secure program platform. They shouldn't be posted on any public facing platforms. And Amy, I believe, will keep powering through.
Yes, thank you, Lori.
Actually, Lori, I think this is you on submission deadlines.
Yes.
Sorry.
For those who may not be aware, we do have the complete schedule of submission deadlines on the CalTPA website. It's actually on the TPA homepage. I do think there is a link to also access it from the faculty website. This isn't the complete list. It didn't quite fit on the slide. We do have submission windows all the way through June. There is at least one submission window in each month, and candidates who submit by the date listed here can expect to receive their results within 3 weeks on the corresponding results date next to that. So the full schedule is available on the CalTPA website.
Okay, so Amy, I'll take this one, upcoming events. As you can see, we have a virtual think tank coming up on September 25th from 10 to 11 a.m. And the topic will be tackling implicit bias. And we have 3 experts in this field that we're excited to present to you as we confront this both in current events and also what we deem as what's best for our students in classrooms across our state. There will be a demo for Results Analyzer if you would like to get more information about how to pull data for preliminary programs, which will be on October the 12th from 1:30 to 3:30 p.m. We are going to have a faculty training workshop on October 27th from 9 to 3. We will have a break in there, we promise, also time for lunch. But a faculty training workshop on the CalTPA that was similar to what was offered last year, but we unfortunately had to cut our last one out because of the COVID pandemic, and to keep everyone safe, we decided to schedule it into the fall. And then our next CalTPA coordinator meeting will be on January 21st, 2021 at 1 o'clock to approximately 2:30 p.m. Going forward, some other ongoing supports that are going to be very helpful for you to be aware of is, if we could go to the next slide. We do hold weekly office hours, both for candidates, teacher induction programs, and preliminary programs. You can see the times are and the days are here. Every Wednesday from 4:15 to 5, we are working with candidates, those executive order and PS VTW candidates who need to complete the CalTPA. Teacher induction directors are invited to join us on Thursdays from 9 to 9:45 a.m. We had quite a few of them with us today. And then preliminary programs also join us on Thursdays from 10 to 10:30 a.m. We have our monthly virtual think tanks listed here. They are generally the last Friday of the month. And the quarterly coordinator meetings, the winter is in January 21st, and then spring is March 31st. So the last piece that I would like to share with you for online support is going to be, oh, I'm sorry, go one back, is the CTC has a YouTube channel, and we invite you to look at this web address to access it. What I would really recommend that you do is to subscribe to the CTC's YouTube channel. That way you will get updates whenever anything is posted to the CTC's YouTube channel. And then specifically, we have our own group of supports in a CalTPA playlist, which is listed here at this bit.ly. It is case sensitive, so please make sure that when you type in the letters, especially after that last /, that you do make sure that you utilize the proper capitalization. We will be posting this as well as yesterday's session onto the playlist. Yesterday's session is already in the process of rendering. Hopefully will be available this evening. Because we are ensuring that there's closed captioning as well as other items, it does take a little bit longer than it would in normal circumstances. And also YouTube does checks to make sure that nothing has been lifted or that we're trying to monetize anything. So that's why that takes a little bit longer. So Amy, that is it for our formal presentation with the program supports and other items with Cycle 2. So I'll turn it back to you to just show everyone our final slide with our contact information. And then, like you said, we can stay on and answer some more questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So all of you, thank you so much for what you are doing to support our candidates. California needs quality teachers and leaders in our state. And we so appreciate the time and attention and coaching that you give all our candidates. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We're here to support you as you need us. We just shared all kinds of ways you can find us. We are live every week on those office hours and hope you join us there. And of course, we try and record and post all of our live webinars for you so that you can attend. Remember that even candidates now can call us directly and ask their questions on Wednesday afternoons. So thank you for being with us. If you do have additional questions, we will go ahead and stay. I do want to thank both Mick and Beth for their expertise, and Lori for supporting us in putting this webinar on, and of course James, my colleague. Thanks to everyone, and we're here to help. So we will we'll just go ahead and let people who need to get off go ahead and leave and get on to their next Zoom meeting, or work with their children to get their homework done, or get dinner started, whatever you need to do. And we will stay here though and see if there are some more questions that folks have.
Thank you very much.
I did promise we'd talk about COVID and flexibilities, and really mostly what we would have done was just shared that the Commission's website, and I'll put that in the chat, but you would go to the Commission's website at www.ctc.ca.gov, and the very first thing that comes up is a big banner that says COVID. If you go into that, through that portal and into all the landing pages, you'll find lots and lots of supports that have been published there around what's happening with COVID and flexibilities and things like that. And we can share with you that the executive order that was signed to give candidates more time to do their performance assessment work post-preliminary, an extension of that is on the governor's desk for signature. He has not signed it yet. Again, he has not signed it yet, but we do expect him to sign it. So that will help everyone have some flexibility during this academic year from July to July. So the 2020-21 school year, since we're still seeing lots of folks trying to grapple with these difficult times of COVID. So yes, the video recordings to share what to do. So again, We do have all that guidance on our website, and we went over several slides with you today. The assessment guide book, however, stands. So we need the same number of videos. The same length of video time is still held. We need to see the candidates and the students in these videos. So all of that is described in depth in this presentation as well as on the website. If your candidates are in a district and there is no video recording or there is no synchronous instruction, then these candidates perhaps need to complete their programs and delay completing the performance assessment. You cannot complete and pass a performance assessment without synchronous teaching, even in our online. Can this happen online? Yes, and we've seen some really successful submissions with online virtual settings. So if you have an explicit question, Heather, and you'd like to let us know, we're happy to have you unmute and just ask your question or put it in the chat.
Amy, could I give a little bit of just an example of how our district pursued that issue?
That would be great.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Heather, we ran into a similar kind of district level problem with that. And so what I was able to do is talk with the Associate Superintendent for Instructional Services and explain the challenge this was going to pose to all of our teaching, student teachers, co-teachers, anybody trying to complete the TPA. It affects administrator candidates who are trying to complete their CalAPA as well, and anybody else who really has a legitimate need to have captured video footage. And what they were able to do was go back to the district's legal advisors and say, okay, how are we going to do this? And they did come up with a policy. It's not quite as explicit as I would have liked, but basically a little bit of wiggle room for these kinds of situations. So what I would suggest is you do that if there's a way to get to the upper levels of administration. The other thing I found is that sometimes there will be a district policy in place that isn't as rigorous as it is being interpreted by site administrators. So I've seen another case where the person was told they couldn't record, but in fact they could. It was the principal misread the policy. So being able to go up a little bit above at the level of the site and go to the district leadership may help you resolve that issue.
Great, Beth. That's great. Yeah, there's going to have to be a lot of local advocacy, and we have found even in LAUSD, who was very, very explicit that there would be no video recording. They have managed to work with their union and their legal team, and they're going to be moving forward with an exception. We hope any day now for candidates who are trying to engage in performance assessment for educative purposes so they can become teachers and leaders in our schools. So it is going to take everyone working together, but it's a great time for teacher preparation programs to be working more closely than ever with their colleagues in the district to make sure that our incoming teachers are feeling supported and welcomed into the profession. And even though these are difficult times, I think we can still prepare great teachers and we can still help them get credentialed, but we're going to have to work together to make that happen. So we're having some questions too about informal rubrics for informal assessments. Either Mick or Beth, do you want to just talk through some examples that you've seen? I'm going to put in the chat just, to check out the online example to see an exact example of an informal assessment rubric that was submitted by a candidate, but maybe one or both of you could speak to what those rubrics look like for informal assessments.
I can say that, of course, you're not going to necessarily need a rubric for every informal assessment that a candidate will do, and that's kind of a little overkill. So what I would do is work with the candidate to identify sort of a semi-formal, informal assessment, perhaps, where it could be an exit ticket at where they're demonstrating the skill that they've been working on during that day. And you have a little rubric, maybe it's 3 levels. It's, student did not complete the exit ticket and does not demonstrate understanding of the content. And maybe the middle ground is, they were able to answer X and Y, but they weren't sure about Z. And then the 3rd level or 4th level could be they were able to articulate. So that's a rubric where you're using it to give specific feedback that allows the candidate to then make forward progress in what the instruction would be. But again, they would have to choose an informal rubric fairly carefully. It's not going to be a thumbs up, thumbs down kind of question that you're using to check for understanding.
Mick, do you want to add anything?
Sure, I was muted there for a second. Sure. Well, Beth took my example because we do see a lot of exit tickets as part of their informal assessment, but we've also seen homework assignments that cover it. And then it would be that the students were able to identify these things. Level 1 is they were able to learn they have basic understanding of the concept. They have moderate understanding and full understanding, things like that. And I think Beth made a good point, is that not everything that you use as a formal assessment would have a rubric. And so you don't want to choose questions and answers, or you don't want to choose observations and write, I'm going to observe my students and take notes. But you want to pick an assignment or an exit ticket or a lab write-up or something that they're going to turn in that you can evaluate with a rubric.
Right. I would even say for younger students, when you're using, for example, a running record type instrument, or you're walking around the room observing children doing something, you can still write qualitative language to explain levels of performance. So that's all we're saying, is that even in this informal checking for understanding, if you're checking for understanding, then you need to have something in your head that you're listening for or you're watching for from a student when they're demonstrating that, whether it's questions or whatever, right? So, and as we pointed out, it's a scale, right? From student was not able to respond, blah, 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 to a comprehensive description of a response. And yeah, it can be simple. The thing that we're trying to get across here is that even in informal assessment, you, the teacher, need to know what you're listening for. What are you expecting to hear students say back to you? And when they say it, what does that mean in light of the learning goal? So it's really important in measurement to be clear. What are we measuring? What are we looking for? What should we see? What should we hear? What should it look like? And then the candidate describes that in qualitative steps. So again, we've got some examples posted. You can take a look there. And it is a little bit of a unique thing to think about it in that way, to have a rubric for informal, but it's just so important with young teachers. It's not, teaching and learning should be purposeful. It shouldn't be just random. It should be purposeful. We're striving towards learning some kind of content in some particular way, perhaps. So what is it we expect to see our students say to us? What should we see them doing? What should we be looking for, etc. So,
Amy, can I have one more thing?
Yeah, please.
And I think one thing that I've learned when I take my role of assessor and take that off and go to my teacher role, and when I'm teaching my classes, is that students need to be taught how to write a rubric. A lot of them don't know that. And so there are a lot of examples out there. There's a lot of good articles about how to write rubrics, how to make them efficient. And I really now spend a day in my class teaching them, okay, this is how we write a rubric, so they know how to do that. Because a lot of times, teachers are brought up with an answer key, or or whatever, or a checklist. They do all these things, and they really need to write rubrics.
Right. I mean, when I think back to what I got in public school, I got smiley faces or unhappy faces or check pluses. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't, how does the candidate understand what that even means? So that's,
I got a lot of sad faces.
Right. And even an
I was
A,
that kid.
Right? An A on a paper. What does that mean? So that's all. We're trying to kind of dig in here and say, teachers need to be clear with students about what they need to hear, what they need to see, what they need to observe. And the way we can do that with students is to put it down in writing in these qualitative steps. So that's what we're seeing is happening as an outcome in cycle 2.
So I could,
Amy and Mick. Oh, go ahead, Brave.
oh, I was just going to say, to kind of build on that, you know, even if you're using in a lower elementary grade, like maybe the smiley face, the in-between face and the sad face or whatever, there's still a way to make that work. That the candidate should still be clarifying in their head and articulating to their students, what does that smiley face represent? Well, you know, and I've seen candidates even for secondary do this where, you know, it's some sort of an emoticon type rubric system, but it's not just, oh, gee, everything's great, you did it well. It's very much articulating. If you got a smiley face, it means that you answered in a complete sentence, you spelled all the words right, and you answered exactly what we were asking you for the question. Yeah, and so it's articulating in their own minds what it is that they're expecting to see as a qualitative answer.
So my biggest question, I did participate in the training that you had this summer with Tulare County Office of Education, and she was awesome and did a great job, but didn't have a lot of TK to 2 examples. So any website suggestions or TK to 2 examples so we can avoid the smiley faces and the sad faces would be really helpful.
Can you tell me more about what, I don't know what you're talking about, what Tulare presentation?
Oh my gosh, it was the assessment coordinator at Tulare County Office of Education, and I'm sorry, I don't remember her name.
Oh, well, that's up to, you know, Tulare County, that we were not involved, I don't think, in that presentation, but
Yeah, I
we can
apologize.
certainly provide examples. I mean, and frankly, if you just Google on the website, you're going to see a lot of examples. They're
Okay.
everywhere. All the teacher Facebook sites. I'm trying to think of some of them. Mick or Beth, are there particular teacher support sites that you send your teachers to see examples of lesson plans or rubrics or anything like that that you could suggest?
Not off the top of my head.
James, any websites you can think of that you would send teachers to see examples of lesson plans or rubrics?
Oh, that's a good one. Let me look at my bookmarks. Hold on just a second.
Because there's just so much. If anything, there's more, you know, there are more things out there on the web than are even sometimes helpful. So it's important to make sure that we are using examples that are really helpful to teacher candidates. And like I said, this is a deeper issue. The issue is that teacher candidates need to have more opportunity to learn about how to recognize and quote unquote measure student growth and performance in their classrooms. So they need to understand, you know, how do you, if, for example, just asking questions is a real skill that we need to develop in our teachers. How do you ask those questions that elicit that deeper thinking on the part of students, right? There's a lot of work out in that, even in that realm, how to write and ask questions. And then of course, lots out there of examples over and over on student rubrics and how rubrics are used. There's a lot of good information on student self-assessment. We were just using an article that we found actually from Canada when we were working with our special education